Okay. Yes? Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Mariia Shynkarenko. I'm the research director in Ukrainian European Dialogue Program. Thank you all for showing up tonight. It is a very sad and depressing day for many of us, and I'm especially grateful that we have Professor Chernetsky to lift our spirits with his lecture. For those of you who don't know, Professor Chernetsky teaches Slavic languages and literatures at the University of Kansas. As an educator and researcher, he combines his work on Ukrainian, Russian, and Slavic literatures and culture with a variety of cross-disciplinary studies such as film, gender, LGBTQ+ studies, Jewish studies, translation studies, diaspora, and migration studies. He's also the author of award-winning book, Mapping Post-Communist Cultures, Russia and Ukraine in the Context of Globalization, of 5 edited volumes and multiple articles on contemporary Russian and Ukrainian culture. Professor Chernetsky is also an accomplished translator and an editor of Ukrainian book series at Academic Studies Press, also our partner project with whom we work closely. And currently, Professor Chernetsky is the president of Association for Slavic, East European and Eurasian Studies, an important organization that brings hundreds of scholars in Slavic studies for convention annually. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mariia, and thank you so much, everyone, for coming here this evening. I am glad to have this opportunity. It's a great honor to be speaking here at the IWM, an institution that I've long admired. And yes, we are speaking on a day that for many of us is stressful, and a day for a lot of reflection and thinking of what do we do next. And I hope that perhaps looking at the case of the city of Odessa and its resilience in the face of many challenges that it had experienced historically might help us in this project and this endeavor. So I approach this wearing 2 different hats. One, of course, is a hat of a scholar. The other one, the hat of a native of that city. And that city has a peculiar place within both Ukrainian, European, and global history and culture. And I hope to help us through the journey of today's conversation get a better sense and understanding of both how it went and what directions does it have in the future. So let's get started. It's going to be a little tricky, but we'll do that. So what are we doing about this city? First, we see where it is on the map. And as you see, it's on the edge of Ukraine. It is on the shores of the Black Sea, the largest city on the shores of the Black Sea. And it is a city which has that certain je ne sais quoi, that certain unique quality that distinguishes it from many other places, that in an English neologism we can describe as Odessity, Ukrainian Odeskist or Russian Odeskist. It is, very importantly, it's a port city which is in love with its past, but with its past that is somewhat mythologized. And the 2 cities that can be compared to in this respect would be Trieste, which was the main port city of the Habsburg Empire, or Alexandria, if we look at it through the prism of the poems of Constantine Cavafy. And especially, I guess, speaking in Vienna about Trieste, I mean, visiting Trieste, and you see that it's basically its central part is a little Vienna by the sea. It's regularly planned. The architecture is Viennese and not like the rest of Italy. Its cafe culture is closer to the Viennese cafe culture than the coffee culture of the rest of Italy. Its food is also different. But it is now part of Italy, and within the context of Italy, it had to rethink, reinvent itself, think of its multicultural past and how that multicultural past impacts its present and where it goes in the future. And what we need to do in the case of Odessa, and this is something that I have been talking about a lot, is to change the epistemic frame through which we approach that city, and is use and approach Ukraine more broadly and think of various epistemic injustices that optics, that imperial epistemic frame has been producing. And as a little footnote, for those of you who might not be familiar with the term epistemic injustice, this is a very prominent area of philosophical inquiry that has been booming, especially in the last 15 years or so. The pioneering scholar of that is the British philosopher Miranda Fricker, who more recently has moved to the United States. She now is a professor at NYU. And it has been taken a lot by many different scholars. And its origins are in feminist interventions in philosophy and in history of science, and challenging the idea of classical epistemology that an epistemic agent, in other words, a person who learns something, who comes to possess acquired new knowledge and to receive knowledge from someone else, that epistemic agent is someone who is abstract, gender neutral, and does not have any specific features. So the whole idea of positionality, a word that has become more familiar to us in humanities and social science research, that is the idea that as a human being, you're always situated in a context, and whether we like it or not, that context impacts the perspectives we assume, and we can never be completely free of that context. That creates epistemic frames, and in the case of epistemic injustices, there are two aspects. It's a certain kind of knowledge is precluded from reaching people who are prevented from learning it, and on the other hand, certain people, certain knowers, as the philosopher would say, are disadvantaged in the opportunity to share their knowledge with others because their knowledge is dismissed, discounted as not objective, as prejudiced, as of minor importance. And we've had numerous examples in the room in the past where at a panel, for example, a scholar from Russia and a scholar from Ukraine will be speaking, and the scholar from Russia would be presumed to be speaking from a universal neutral standpoint, and the scholar of coming from Ukrainian background would be presumed to be speaking from a more narrow, limited perspective, and therefore the interpretations, the approaches in the audience to whom these people would be speaking would be completely different. One would be received as a bona fide expert on the start, given an extra credit, an excessive credibility, and the other one would have discounted credibility. In other words, just because of where this person is coming from, there will be a certain prejudice that their opinions, their knowledge, the facts, and the experiences that they share somehow can be discounted. Of course, it does not only have to do with gender or with nation. Classic histories, of course, have to do with race. So one of the clearest cases would be the novel To Kill a Mockingbird and how it treats the evidence coming from an African-American speaker in the context of old, racist, segregated American South. So we have many examples of this kind. And I am honored and encouraged that after I began actively introducing this concept in discourse around Ukraine after the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, advocating for the need to change in our approaches to Ukraine, its presence in global culture, its presence in the world, and its role and what it can share with the rest of the world. This has been picked up by a lot of other colleagues. So this is now a term that you can hear used in relation to the place of Ukraine within the world quite a bit. So I'm glad that this change has happened. So And just like the rest of Ukraine, Odessa surprised people at the start of the full-scale invasion. And one can say, looking at the world's reaction, that the world was, of course, really shocked at the fierceness, brutality, and the criminal nature of Russia's invasion. But Ukraine's existence, Ukraine's agency, Ukraine's resistance to that invasion was a greater shock. It was more unexpected to the rest of the world than Russia's invasion. So that was one of the biggest paradoxes, and this is one of the tragic aspects of Ukraine's visibility and presence, is that we do not need to explain anymore where Ukraine exists and why it matters, but it happened for this specific tragic reason. And this is not the first time that this happens in Ukraine's history. Another example, not that many decades ago, would be the Chernobyl nuclear catastrophe, and the world started looking at the map and realized what Chernobyl is and how geographically it impacts. And that was why, for instance, when the Soviet Union collapsed and Ukraine gained its independence, one of Ukraine's leading contemporary authors, Yuri Andrukhovich, a name that I do not need to introduce to this audience, commented that for us, independence arrived with a bitter taste of the apocalyptic, given the context of the Chernobyl catastrophe. So there was one episode back in the 80s, and there is another episode now. So here you see Odessa's resistance. And these are photographs and, of signs of resistance that are directed at the potential Russian invader. Russian troops never reached Odessa, but it was in serious danger. And therefore, they are in Russian, and they are defiant. On the left, you see sandbags in front of Odessa's iconic opera house, one of the city's most famous buildings, probably its most famous building. Odessa is one of the few cities in Eastern Europe whose most important item is not the city hall, it's not a cathedral, it's an opera house. And it's an opera house by Viennese architects. The same Helmer and Fellner, who built dozens of opera houses around Central and Eastern Europe, they also designed this opera house. This is probably one of their most opulent creations, because at the time the city was exceedingly wealthy. And so there's a lot of gold and Carrara marble and a lot of other things. And it has been beautifully restored, and it has wonderful acoustics, and it's a great place to visit, not just for the architecture, but also for the theatrical life there. But this picture is also a visual rhyme to a very famous photo from 1941, when Odessa was surrounded by German and Romanian troops. So Romania is the ally from Nazi Germany, and it was the defense of Odessa. And so this very clear, defined appropriation and use of the memory of the city's heroic defense in 1941. And this is a city that the invaders were not able to capture. The troops left because the front was too far behind, and relocated mostly to Sevastopol, which was under brutal attack. So Odessa is a city that actually they never captured. It was just that the troops left. On the right, you see another iconic one. This is defiantly using the slang that was associated with the city's sort of flavor as a city where there is presence of some organized crime, and that the criminals would call Odessa, Odessa Mama. So if anybody dares to touch Mama, Mama would bury them. And you see a little paper boat sinking, and this is a defiant message to the Black Sea Fleet of the Russian Navy. And on the far right, you see Duc de Richelieu, who later became Prime Minister of France under the Bourbon Restoration, but was the mayor of Odessa in the early 19th century as a political refugee because he was an opponent of Napoleon. So we see the European engagement and all these traditions in a defined message we are here, we resist, don't dare touch us. And what is very important also is that given the city has this very serious engagement with this cultural myth, is that it is being rethought. It is discussed and reevaluated by local intellectuals, and it's a wonderful partnership between the intellectuals and especially the younger members of the city's business entrepreneurial community. And this was a study that was co-sponsored by UNESCO and the European Union. Odessa's historic city center finally got its status as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2022, as the Russian troops started their full-scale invasion of Ukraine. It was planned for decades, but there were a lot of bureaucratic delays, so the final push-through actually happened in 2022. So with the help, they organized this critical rethinking, reevaluation of what is that past city myth. How do we deal with it? Do we transform it, and where do we go forward from it? And there is a wonderful project that resulted from that, and this is Odessa Decolonization. You can see the Instagram page there. This is a picture taken more than half a year ago, so there have been many more posts on that Instagram page. Again, I strongly recommend it for both the studies, the opinion polls they did, the public discussions that they organized, the very active engagement both within the city and within Ukraine more broadly, and more broadly with the global audiences. In other words, it's a very serious, ongoing, transformative intellectual project. And another very important message, I would say, is what came from this work, a very recent essay by the wonderful local Odessan public intellectual and poet Zoya Kazanji. This was an essay from March of this year. Хто такі Одесити, чого ми хочемо? Who are the Odessans and what do we want? And this is a very important statement in that even the author herself, given her background, the combination of a Greek first name and the Tatar last name, which is her married last name, not her maiden name, but she is even personally an epitome of Odessa's diverse origins and the diversity of its inhabitants. The title deliberately refers to the famous essay by Mikhail Hrushevsky, the first president of Ukraine, who back in 1917 wrote, "Who are the Ukrainians and what do they want?" as an explainer pamphlet for the global powers, especially the European powers. This new place, Ukraine, was trying to gain its independence, first autonomy, then full independence from Russia, and where it is, who they are, what do they actually want. Here, the question, it's not so much an explainer for the outsiders, but an open question to the Odessans. So it's asking us internally, those of us who are from Odessa, what is the city trying to do? What does it want? What did it want in the past? And how does its understanding of the self developed further? And there are many more, there are numerous cities around the world which have a very strong identity. And a lot of people would say, for instance, that they're New Yorkers first and maybe an American second. And in Odessa, that local city patriotism historically has always been very, very strong. However, what is important is that in the last 10 years, in other words, in the aftermath of the Revolution of Dignity since 2014, just like in the rest of Ukraine, civil society has grown and developed by leaps and bounds. The same transformation happened in Odessa. So the overwhelming majority of Odessans retain their strong city patriotism, but it is combined with the very strong sense of civic belonging to the project of Ukraine. The project of Ukraine as a country of values, a country of ideas, and a country of diverse heritage that is resisting its colonial past and tries to rethink it and transform itself and to see how it goes forward into the future. And for academic perspectives, I would recommend the book, which happened to be published in the series that I edit on cosmopolitan spaces of Odessa, which is co-edited by Professor Mariia from the University of Regensburg and Professor Ephraim Zicher from Hebrew University in Jerusalem. And this book has many different takes in it, but I'm highlighting the three articles in particular that to me were especially important to see. Yohanan Petrovsky-Stern, who is a prominent specialist in Ukrainian Jewish culture and Ukrainian Jewish historical relations, professor at Northwestern University, and brother of the writer Katya Petrovska, who lives in Berlin and who is perhaps known to this audience as a German language writer. So he is looking at Vladimir Zeev Jabotinsky, one of the very important founding figures in of the state of Israel, and who is a native of Odessa, who is very much a product of Odessan culture, and who very actively advocated the dialogue and rapprochement between the Jewish community and the ethnic Ukrainian community within the city, and both of them the sense of being oppressed and colonized within the Russian Empire, and therefore the Jewish emancipation and Ukrainian emancipation are allies that should collaborate. We have in Alexander Zabirko's work, and Zabirko teaches at the University of Regensburg, the first in any Western language really comprehensive look at the Odessan text in Ukrainian literature, because Odessa is like some of the other cities, like Vienna, for example, like Paris and London, and many, Berlin, you name it, like lots of European and global cities, has its own identified urban, also not just a myth, but a series of textual representations of the city's identity. But for the world, it was mostly familiar with those representations in Russian language writing. And so Zabirko's article is a very important corrective that shows the city's very important presence in Ukrainian language literature. And he focuses primarily on the final decades of the 19th and first decades of the 20th century. But even within that short period, it showcases how incredibly rich and how quickly evolving was that image of the city. And Amelia Glazer, who is a professor at the University of California, San Diego, in her contribution to this book, is looking at Boris Khersonsky, or Boris Khersonsky, a very important voice from Odessa, one of the city's leading poets, somebody who, in his writing, epitomizes this diversity as somebody who is Jewish by background, a convert to Christianity. He was part of the series of Soviet-era dissidents who converted to Christianity, liberal versions of Christianity in the 1970s. Somebody who both looks at the past of the Jewish community in Odessa and more broadly in Ukraine, at the city, and at also the stereotypes of its representation, and at the language policies. He writes in Ukrainian, he writes in Russian, he self-translates. And for him, writing is a form of public diary. So this is another very important feature, and the same Professor Glazer has a wonderful article coming out, co-authored with another colleague in the next issue of Slavic Review, where she will be looking at her work at creating a digital archive of contemporary Ukrainian poetry since the Revolution of Dignity. And what is very important and unique for Ukraine is that social media, we'll see what happens now, because a lot of people are beginning to get distaste of the corporate channels, but Facebook in particular has been an important factor in revolutionary mobilization and also in sharing things. A lot of contemporary Ukrainian poets often post their new poems on Facebook, and this does not prevent or preclude them from later publishing them in books or journals. So poetic texts live these dual existences in those two media. And this also, posting them on social media allows for those kind of immediate comments. And this is what Chersonsky has been doing on the internet since the late 1990s, since the very early internet days, the days of LiveJournal as a popular platform, and then migrating to others, engaging with that model, but also subverting its stereotypes. What are the stereotypes? I apologize for having this photo. This is a still from the notorious Russian TV series Liquidation, which is set in Odessa shortly after the end of World War II, and which basically tries to kick into higher gear the stereotype of Odessa as a city, as I like to say, of jolly Jewish gangsters. Not all Odessans are gangsters, not all the gangsters are Jewish, not all of them are jolly, but this is something that has been sort of this millstone sort of weighing on the city. And up until 2022, this is also that has been actively recycled by the local tourism industry. So if visitors from outside Ukraine or from even from other cities in Ukraine would come and visit, most likely the easiest guided tours to get would be Russian language tours about the city's criminal paths and various thieves, male and female, and their exploits, which for a lot of people in the city was really cringe-inducing, but there is very little you could do, and now it is changing. The problem is that this was not only done by Russian mass media or local tourist industry, but by colleagues who engage in serious academic research and should know better. As an example, you have covers of these two books by very respected American historians. On the right, Tales of Old Odessa, Crime and Civility in a City of Thieves without quotation marks. On the cover, you have the Opera House, the same Opera House as supposedly the main den of those thieves. If you search the text, the word Ukraine never appears in it, and the word Ukrainians only appears once in the phrase the anti-Semitic Russians and Ukrainians. On the left, City of Rogues and Schnorrers, Russia's Jews and the Myths of Old Odessa. I'm not a specialist in German. I was told that the word Schnorrer means different things in different regional varieties. In Yiddish, Schnorrer means beggars, but pretend beggars. Not at least that's what colleagues explained to me. Somebody said, oh, woe is me, I'm a miserable, unfortunate person, but they're not being truthful. They're more like playful about this. So that is the interpretation that this colleague is advancing. And again, this was the stereotype, and it was presented through this very narrow view of supposed criminality, of the invisibility of other cultures, and flattening of the city's image. But not to be outdone, there are other colleagues who advance other theories. This colleague on the covers of two books, and here have the Potemkin Steps with the statue of Duke Richelieu on top, the Grand Staircase, whose architect was Francesco Boffo. And yes, most 19th century architects of Odessa were Italian. Boffo, Frappolli, Bernardazzi, Morandi, the names all speak for themselves. But this colleague takes this one step further and basically says that Italians were the dominant community. So you may have heard about the Jews, you may have heard about the Greeks, that's all not true, it was all Italians. And really sort of goes over the top, and in the process, what happens is one of the reasons for Odessa's 19th century boom was that it had a Porto Franco status. In other words, it was a city that was tax exempt. It was a booming port. It was primarily exporting grain from the Russian Empire, primarily from the nearby Ukrainian regions. And its main destination was Livorno, the main port of Tuscany as an independent state before Risorgimento. So Risorgimento actually was bad for Odessa because it lost one of its main clients. And so Livorno, I guess, would be another one of those cities which had grand port pasts and then declined. But who were the merchants who were mainly organizing it? They were Sephardim from Greece who came to Odessa, and they were the main sort of organizers of this trade. So she, of course, rechristens them all part of the pod as Italians. So in other words, we have these contested stories going on, but the story is not all that bad. I highly, highly recommend the work of these two scholars. Patricia Herlihy, who until her death was a professor at Brown University. She's the doyenne of Western historians of Odessa. She started researching the city in the early 1970s. She was the first Western academic to actually go into local archives. She wrote a classic history of the city from 1794 until 1914. That is from its takeover by the Russian Empire until the start of World War I. And this book gathers her essays. It was compiled while she was still alive with her blessing. It unfortunately was published already a few weeks after she passed away, but it is a record of her scholarship over 40 years. On the right, Tanya Richardson is a human geographer working in Canada and Wilfrid Laurier University. And here, her book, Kaleidoscopic Odessa, it's a little older, 2007, but very important, and that it looks precisely at the diversity within the city. And a very interesting cover. You have 19th century vernacular architecture, not the opera house, not the grand staircase. We have houses that are 200 years old, but this is not grand fancy construction, but you see also the different fates in the 1990s and what is happening and how even one and the same old element can be transformed and taken into different directions. What also has been hugely important is that the city really has taken an important, multiple important steps to change itself. In 2014, as we know, it was a site of a tragedy on May 2nd. So in the aftermath of the Revolution of Dignity, Russia was really trying to foment unrest in other parts of Ukraine, including Odessa. And in Odessa, there was a clash between the supporters and opponents of the revolution. There was a building that caught fire in which over 40 people died. Earlier in the day, several supporters of the revolution were shot. So a very, very tragic day in the city's history, which then, of course, Russian propaganda really tried to abuse as the talking point for the various whataboutisms about Ukraine. But what I think was very important, that the city's intellectual community decided to take a constructive approach to the situation and actually to establish open dialogue, because they realized that the fracturing, the division in the city's public space was something that was becoming increasingly dangerous. And that was fracturing that was being deliberately enhanced by various forces for very pragmatic reasons like winning elections, but sowing division. And they're trying to move past that to, in fact, look at points of consensus, look at points of consolidation and dialogue. And what you see here in the past is an example of a very practical step that was taken. This is Sotnikivsky Cemetery, within the city limits, but originally it was a village outside what is now the historic core of Odessa. This cemetery most of the graves are from the 1760s, 1770s. If you believe the official Russian myth, Odessa was founded in 1794, where there was nothing. So there was naked steppe with no human presence, and so with the steppe and the sea, and boom, there's this instant city because the empress willed it into existence. And of course, if there are graves and crosses from 10, 20, 30 years before, it means that there were other people who lived there, and that the steppe is not an empty space. It's very similar to the discourses we had in the US history of expansion westward, where the Native American populated territories were seen as an empty territories that needed to be filling. So we have a very similar difference in discourses between the Russian and Ukrainian discourses about those steppe regions. In Ukrainian discourse, the steppe is alive. The steppe is alive, it's populated by people, by non-human residents who are no less important. And so, in fact, there is a very important work being done in eco-criticism now that is looking at the Ukrainian steppe. And I would recommend in particular the work of Darya Tsimbaluk, who recently started teaching at the University of Chicago. She was at the University of St. Andrews before and then at Oxford. And she is a native of Mykolaiv, and so the same southern region of Ukraine, sort of the northern Black Sea littoral, who really doing very important eco-criticism work on this region. And also another very important counterpoint to that dominant myth that comes from flattened to stereotype version of the Odessa myth that some take from the work of Isaac Babel, who is a wonderful writer, but this is not Isaac Babel, this is sort of Aldi version of Isaac Babel, sort of, the reduced and cheap. The counterpoint to that we find in visual arts. And one very important aspect of the city that actually a lot of outsiders do not know is that Odessa has been a major center also of visual arts innovation. That in the late 19th, early 20th century, it also had its secession-like and avant-garde movements, both with the Society of Local Artists that was established in 1890, which was led by Kyriak Kostandi, a local artist who was ethnic Greek by background, but also then the Izdebsky salons, and Izdebsky later immigrated to the US. Izdebsky salons, which started in 1909, were very much sort of Fauvist and avant-garde work. One of the most prominent painters there was Sandro Fazzini, who is the brother of Ilya Ilf, of Ilf and Petrov duo, who later became a very important artist in Paris and tragically perished in the Holocaust. So there is a very important, rich visual history early on. It was a major center of Ukrainian innovation, a lot of presence of the Bolshevik school and others in the 1920s. And like in other places, then the Soviets went about destroying the murals that the Bolsheviks painted. And it was the main center of nonconformist art and in the dissident movement in the 60s and 70s. In fact, if we look at political dissidents, late Soviet era in Odessa, it was concentrated in the visual arts communities. It was the visual artists that the informal networking of the dissidents and human rights activists was happening. And so what we see here is attempts of an exhibition by a wonderful collective called Минуле майбутнє мистецтво, Past Future Art, that it's colleagues from many different backgrounds looking at memory studies and other contemporary memory politics and things of that kind through the prism of visual arts. On the left, you see Yuri Yegorov, a painting by Yuri Yegorov, who was the leader of the nonconformists in the 60s and the 70s, who tries to take that Odessan essence of and this is a hot noon on the beach in August, where it's so hot that everybody hides, but you still have the sea and the beach and houses by the beach. And it's emptied out of human presence, but it's there. It's sort of like a magic realist or metaphysical quality. In fact, a lot of outside visitors, especially outside visitors who are visual artists, remark to Odessa artists, you live here in a Giorgio de Chirico painting. And this is a Chirico-like atmosphere. On the right, you see the work by Alexander Roitburt, who became a leading figure in the city's visual art, sadly passed away in 2021 of cancer, relatively young. And this is him playing with those metaphysical messages. So you see the same opera house, but it's now floating on an island in a sea. You see the two white spheres, which are the entrance of the Langeron beach, one of the most famous beaches in the city, also an iconic thing. So it is a metaphysical landscape, like imaginary ruins that you would have in, like, say, neoclassical painting from the 18th century, but it also is in dialogue with Sots art painting. If you think of Komar and Milamid, they have, for example, have Kremlin floating on an island like that. So it is about the power of myth, but also about critically distancing themselves from the myth, inviting us to critically reflect on what is going on. And so Boris Khersonsky, whom I mentioned already through Amelia Glazer, these examples of his books, again illustrated by Roitburt. How are we doing on time? Sorry, we're still good. So again, both the critical deconstruction of the myth, the Odessa Intelligentsia book, the Odessa Intelligentsia, is basically a series of commedia dell'arte-like sketches, which has stock characters, one of whom was personified Odessa Intelligentsia, but also there's the personified Odessa KGB informer. And then, of course, there's our poet, who in his day job is a clinical psychologist. So therefore, he is a patient at a mental institution, and therefore, ironically discounts that. On the right is his book, There Was No Stalin, which is a defiant look at the potential of alternative history, and it was his first book in Ukrainian, where he deliberately wanted to make sure that he was speaking with a voice that is uniting with and engaging in a more important dialogue with other poets in Ukraine. In fact, one of the very important aspects of the consequences of Revolution of Dignity of 2014 is that it fostered internal dialogue, including in the literary field, between writers who wrote in Russian and writers who wrote in Ukrainian. The Russophone literature, such as it existed in Ukraine before, was incredibly fragmented, and it not even united as a phenomenon within Ukraine. There was the Odessa literary scene, the Donetsk literary scene, the Kharkiv literary scene, the Dnipro literary scene, and they did not even really know much about each other, let alone of what is happening in Ukrainian language literature. What has happened since then is that there, tragically again, because of the war, because of displacement and refugees, we've had a much more concerted effort to get to know each other, to overcome those past isolations and fracturing and actually develop a unified voice. And as a little bit of a theoretical excursus, again, this is something that should be familiar for many people here. I suggest that one of the ways in which we can constructively approach the situation, both in Odessa and in Ukraine more broadly, is the work of Michael Rothberg, who is currently a professor at UCLA, and his book, Multidirectional Memory, has been very, very influential, subtitled Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization. And there are a couple of very word-busy slides following where I tried to highlight some of the things that Michael was talking about. And basically, to summarize what was happening in those very busy slides, there is an established and persistent notion that there is a competition and rivalry within the field of memory and memory politics. And especially, unfortunately, this happens often to minority communities, and therefore, in vying for attention, they ended up sometimes seen as competing with each other in sort of the zero sum, that memory attention is a limited resource. And so Professor Rothberg invites us to imagine the possibilities of what we can do when we not approach it as zero sum, but actually see about two different aspects of historical traumas. And in the case of Europe, that would be the Holocaust and colonialism and the aftermath of colonial empires, to see them as not competing with each other, but part of the same history with which we have to engage. And that sometimes we can see through the past traumas, through the misunderstandings, through the othering and the stereotyping, and actually try to work for savvy and creative resistance, and to look for new forms of collectivity and new visions of justice. So in other words, this traumatic past needs to be acknowledged, and as such, this acknowledgement can be then a building block for moving forward, for thinking of even not becoming overwhelmed, determined by the past traumas, not letting it paralyze us and freeze us with all the other bad news that are happening in the world, but to see what we can do, how we can mobilize ourselves to build coalitions, to imagine ways in which we can bring together a vision of the world that is more just and more inclusive, new forms of solidarity and new visions of justice. And this happens not simply, not easily. It can be a lot of bumps in the road, and certainly recent history shows us there have been a lot of very heavy bumps in this road, but I don't think we should give up this effort. And I think that a positive path is very much possible. And in Ukraine, Odessa, of course, is not the only city which had this difficult path, but there are many others where very important similar work has been done. And here's an example from the city of Lviv, two wonderful books on the right by Oleg Natyuk, Courage and Fear, which is about good people in terrible times. And it's based on family memoirs, and this is a scholar who actually does her personal family archive investigation, but this is very important to then see in the image of goodness, just like we have the righteous, who assisted, protected, the Jewish people within the Holocaust context, what has been going on, acknowledge the traumas, and build on that very imperfect, traumatic past, still a vision of an inclusive future that acknowledges the trauma but looks forward. And Katarzyna Kutyńska's book is also wonderful. It only exists in Polish and Ukrainian. I don't think it's available in Western languages, I may be wrong, but a very important book also about rethinking and rereading the city. So in Odessa, examples of that would be the work of the Dialogue and Tolerance. And scholar whom I especially recommend is Oksana Dovgopolova, who is a professor of philosophy until recently at Odessa University. She just moved to the Kiev School of Economics as of a few weeks ago, but she still lives between the two cities and is very clearly one of the main intellectual leaders in this movement. The Art Museum. Alexander Royburt, until his untimely death, for a final 5 years of his life, was the director of the Odessa Art Museum, which did amazing work, became a world-class, fantastic institution, which critically rethought its entire collection. storage and display, did a series of thoughtful, decade by decade, critical exhibitions of what was happening in there, which culminated in March of 21 with a complete reinstallation of an exhibition. Those who, between March of 21 and February of 22, so just for 1 year, less than a year, you could see that exhibition, and that new museum display in all its richness and glory. Now, of course, it was disassembled. It's in safe storage. The museum has been damaged by Russian shelling several times. They have not hit the museum, but they hit very close to the museum several times. And the building, which is a beautiful neoclassical building from the early 1800s, has sustained, unfortunately, structural damage. They still persevere. They still persevere. The windows are covered with plywood, but they still have public events. They still have thematic exhibitions of contemporary art. They still are an open, engaged institution. And in general, a lot of new research on the emancipatory politics within the city and on the coalitions, and also the part that were obscured by the dominant myth. One of the very important aspects of Odessa, that was the center of Ukraine's film industry in the 1920s. And as this was the time of Ukraine's cultural renaissance, it meant that all the artists and theater actors and directors and writers who from all over Ukraine were coming to work here. Mikhailo Zhuk, one of the leading figures of Art Nouveau secession-style art of Ukraine, lived in Odessa for many decades. But if we look at the film industry, it also would be Vasyl Krychevsky, the founder of Ukrainian national style. Les Kurbos, Ukraine's equivalent of the great theater director innovators all over Europe, and many leading authors, including the futurists like Mikhail Semenko and many others. So there is a novel, yes, and we're very close to wrapping up, that I strongly recommend and that I'm now working on translating into English. And this is Tanger by Ivan Kozlenko, which is the most important Ukrainian language novel about the city, that in an interesting gesture borrows the frame from the narrative frame from Michael Cunningham's The Hours, which engages with the American novel with Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, and does the same with a classic work in Ukrainian literature, Maister Korabля by Yuri Yanovsky, that is set in the 1920s and shows us Odessa as a rich and diverse space, as the center of film industry, but also as a culturally diverse place where so many important things are happening. We also see more important works like this novel, Dzvinka by Nina Kuryata, which is a book shows how a Ukrainian from the nearby small town moves to the city, and how even in the days of final years of Soviet, very repressive anti-Ukrainian language politics, a Ukrainian speaker who was assertive and comfortable in her identity could grow up, even as a child, in that context. It's a semi-autobiographical novel. I was hoping to have a music bonus, which will not be able to do for technical reasons, but I very strongly encourage folks to look up in your internet searches the Jazz on the Balcony series and Yaroslav Trofimov and Peron Nomer 7, a jazz club in Odessa. So basically, Odessa is a very important center of music. Many folks, of course, know Odessa for classical music, for violinists, for piano players, but it's also a very important center of jazz culture, both in the 1920s and now. And so this is jazz musicians who started doing free concerts on the balcony, addressing the city to cheer it up. And they deliberately, emphatically created new Ukrainian language version of old Russian language songs about Odessa. They wanted to sing about the beauty of the city and its resilient spirit in Ukrainian. And that is the song that it has here. And I thank you very much for your patience and attention, and I really look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Chernetsky. That was such a rich and fantastic presentation. I would start probably with a personal question. You started your discussion with the question of positionality, and as a native of Odessa, you grew up in Odessa, how was your own thinking and rethinking of Odessa myth and your relationship to the city has changed through time?
Thank you so much. This is a very important thing and a very important question to ponder. And I think to me it was important to actually temporarily move away from the city. On temporarily, unfortunately, became long-term. But I graduated from secondary school in '86. I originally planned to study in Kyiv, but because of the Chernobyl accident, that just didn't seem like such a good idea. And so my school principal convinced me to try applying to Moscow State University. So I studied in Moscow during perestroika years. And in full accordance with post-colonial theory, being displaced to the center of empire made me a stronger Ukrainian and made me more critically cognizant of the outsider negative stereotyping and made me want to think critically about the identity that before I sort of inhabited without critical reflection. And therefore, I mean, for experiences of Ukrainian in Moscow, this is one of the reasons why I translated Yuri Andruchovich's Moscoviada into English, because it really spoke to some of the experiences that I also had, even though I'm nothing like its main character, what I did. But this also had to do with Odessa, because there is a certain set of prejudices that come in the outside negative stereotyping. And it is simultaneously you're suspected of being, but anti-Semites suspect you of being Jewish, but not being frank. And other people say that you are anti-Semite until you prove otherwise. And I'm not Jewish, but I have family members who are Jewish. I have family members who perished in the Holocaust. I have family members who perished in the Holodomor. I have family members who are ethnically German who immigrated to the U.S. I have, Polish Catholic family. So, like many Odessans, I'm a mutt. I am a mixture of things, but I think this is a city with a rich history that was being suppressed and denied. And then you discover it through small things, like through my late grandmother's cooking. Because she cooked all the traditional Ukrainian food, but she also baked amazing strudel. She also made amazing Italian caponata. And she also, of course, made a full array of Eastern Mediterranean-style dishes, Moldovan, Bulgarian, and even though that side of the family, my mother's side, was not Jewish, there was also a lot of traditional Jewish food like tsimis, like, forshmak, famous Odessan sort of herring pate. This was a staple of life. And so it's a city of this meeting and dialogue of people of different backgrounds, of that kind of engagement that was happening on this vernacular level, but was not always being seriously processed. And also, tragically, it was seen as a city that pushed its talented people out. There was a joke among ex-Odessans that played with a phrase by Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, the father of Russian rocket science. Tsiolkovsky's was, "Earth is the cradle of humanity, but you should not forever live in a cradle." So they would say, Odessa is a cradle, but you should not forever live in a cradle. So that was one of the tragic things. The city produced a lot of talented people, but almost inevitably they were pushed out. And if you look at the writers who are famous for Odessa myth, most of them ended up very shortly after they started publishing, moving to other places. And so that is the myth that is created from the outside. So that's why it was so important for me to then rediscover and reconnect with people like Oksana Dovopolova, who was my classmate. And it was just such a fortuitous thing that, then you lose touch with someone and then you meet them as a colleague, as an intellectual ally, and you realize that we are trying to do many different things, but she's doing from the inside the city, I'm doing from the outside the city, and we're working on this together. So I also had to do with a history of having to prove to other Ukrainians that Odessans are legit Ukrainians, because there is also a lot of negative prejudice, stereotyping among other Ukrainians who visit the city, who sometimes encounter bad customer service, who sometimes hear sort of loud, brash, obnoxious people, and hear a lot of Russian spoken, whether by Odessans or by other tourists, and think of the city as not really Ukrainian. So then you have to explain, well, Odessa has had the largest prosvita organization in Ukraine in the late 19th, early 20th century. It was a major center of Ukrainian publishing industry. The first Ukrainian modernist almanac, edited by Mykola Voronej, was published in Odessa. A lot of other things. The city has a huge, important role in Ukrainian culture that was obscured, that was denied, and therefore it needs to bring this knowledge to itself and to others. That's why Zoya Kazanzhev's question. Odessans need to discover it themselves because they only have had access to very small shards and fragments of the very rich past that the city had. And so you just go down particular rabbit holes, and so you have the rabbit hole of, say, its role in the history of Greece, its role in the history of Bulgaria, its role obviously as a major center of secular Jewish culture, which also has a very complicated role within Jewish culture precisely because it's secular, it's dangerous, it's in Jewish folklore, it's like, a few steps from hell because it's a city of sin as opposed to the pious places elsewhere. All of that is present there. And you just need to bring us together.
Thank you, fascinating. I have like 1,000 questions to follow up, but I will open the floor for the audience. If any of you have comments or questions, please raise your hand. Maybe okay, I see a hand there. Yes, Margajata.
Thank you so much for this talk. I have two questions. One is very simple. Why Odessa and not Odessa? Can you just explain to to an ignorant person how we should really spell the name of the city? And second question is about geographies. I live in New York, and I met some people from Odessa in the city who live in the Brighton Beach. Mm-hmm. And they recreate this combination of sea and land, this experience of living, right, in this liminal space and being on land, but always having access to the city and going to the beach, etc. And it's very characteristic, I think, for Brighton Beach inhabitants that they have this. The Odessa is very much alive there. And so I want to ask you about, how those imagined geographies are impacted by what actually happens, and how Odessa actually lives now as a, in territory that is in war. And, because in academia you have Black Sea studies, right? Mm-hmm. You have all these projects that look at water as a sea, as a connecting space, but it all sounds nice and good, but I want to ask you how, the harsh reality of the war changes those parameters too, and thinking about the city, experiencing the city and imagining it too.
Thank you. Those are both very important questions. So for the first one, it's the difference of the rules of phonetics between Ukrainian and other languages. It's just like we now say Beijing rather than Peking, or Mumbai rather than Bombay. This is going with the Ukrainian pronunciation. So in Ukrainian, really avoids the doubling of the S. There are other consonants can get doubled, but S usually is short, and therefore this is the standard Ukrainian spelling of the city's name. It has always been, as long as Ukrainian orthography has been standardized. As far as the combination of the city and the land, indeed, this was one of the reasons why the 1970s immigration found in Brighton Beach an imperfect but still a reminder of their past. Because for an Odessan, living by the sea is something you grew up with. And the city is really open. It stretches along the sea coast. So having the sea physically near, smelling it, obviously going to the beach, but even sometimes knowing that the beach is there and not necessarily going there every day. But yes, that sea engagement is hugely important. However, the similarity between Odessa and Brighton Beach, or sort of other neighborhoods like Coney Island, and others, is superficial because geography features actually of the U.S. Atlantic coast and Ukrainian Black Sea coast are very different. But it's a reminder, so it becomes like an imperfect reminder that almost inevitably outsiders, they come, they visit, and it always feels like a little bit of a letdown because you have the elevated, subway line, you have the noise, and you have the stores, which basically were recreating the Soviet idea of good life from the 1970s. A lot of sausage and garish clothing and things of that kind, which is why most young people from that community were in a rush to get as far away from it as possible. So it became a place where mostly retired people lived, who therefore had lived in relative isolated lives. So the jokes is, how do you like America? We don't go there. So they didn't really feel that they were living within America. They lived in their little immigrant enclave. Things really changed since the full-scale invasion, like in the rest of communities. First of all, we see a lot of, in the understanding and embrace of Ukraine as a civil society, as a country that is diverse, and as a country that happens to have a Jewish president right now, for a lot of members of the Jewish community, and because the Soviet Union mostly allowed only the Jewish people to emigrate, so non-Jews could not immigrate, could only immigrate if they were married to a Jewish person in that immigration, it's the active re-embrace of that Ukrainianness that you see among so many colleagues. You think of example, I would say, two very prominent contemporary literary figures. Ilya Kaminsky, who is a major poet, and Boris Dralyuk, who is a very prominent poet and also literary translator, who for a while was the editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books. Both Kaminsky and Dralyuk left Odessa as kids, 8 or 9 year old. Both came from Jewish families, which were primarily Russian-speaking. Both have, in recent years, have been very emphatic about the embrace of the Ukrainianness of their identity, that part of their identity is their civic Ukrainian identity, their openness to the Ukrainian language, their engagement with Ukrainian language writing. So through interviews, through the publications that they curate, you see really important changes of this kind happening. And also you see that in the volunteer work in New York, in the protest organizations that demonstrate for the memory of Ukraine, for that war not to be forgotten given the world's short attention span. It is a very diverse coalition, and it very much involves the older people and the younger people, people who live in Brighton Beach, and people who live in other neighborhoods of New York City, and people who, live outside New York as well.
All right, we have one more question.
Edward Serrata, I live here, spend time in Odessa. Sorry. I was going to ask about Kaminsky and Dralyuk. Dralyuk is, isn't he now somewhere near you? And
he is at the University of Tulsa, yes.
Right. And then two other names, if you could comment on the wife, is it the wife of Chersonsky? Who's written for some very good poetry that was published in The New Yorker. Yeah. And then a woman who wrote a novel about 10 years ago in English, Yelena
Aktyorska, yes.
Aktyorska, Panic in a Suitcase, which is easily one of the funniest novels I think I've ever read, but I haven't seen a follow-up.
Yes, thank you for bringing up them both. These are both wonderful women authors. Of the women authors who are currently active in the city, I would especially note Mariia Galina, who is both a diarist and a poet and a critic, and in her early incarnation, a writer of science fiction and fantasy fiction. A really wonderful person. Mariia Galina. Mm-hmm. She, or Mariia Galina, so she writes both in Russian and in Ukrainian. Lyudmila Chersonska, or Lyudmila Chersonskaya in Russian, who is the wife of Boris Chersonsky, is a wonderful poet in her own right. Should not be in any way sort of obscured or overshadowed by her husband. Her writing is very different in style. He is a poet who is very much plays with the richness of past cultural baggage. So he is oriented sort of this, this yearning for global culture that we have in Mandelstam, and we have in Ukrainian neoclassicists like Zerov and other poets from the 1920s. She is a poet who writes about the pain of the trauma now. Even today, speaking of Facebook, she posted 3 poems, current and recent. And what was triggered is that part of the legends of Chersonsky's diaries was that they had 3 cats. And of course, they're now displaced refugees in Italy. And she learned that one of their kitties back in Odessa passed away. Those who follow Chersonsky's diary, this was Jean Cotet de Treville, a cat with a French name. Unfortunately, he passed away. Stunning poems. You would think that a cat is something from a meme, that is something that would be sort of superficially cute. She actually took that and made that one of actually a poem from 2014 where she foreshadowed in the future, oh my God, what might happen if I have to flee as a refugee of the war and I cannot take my cat with me. Sorry, kitty, here is food for a week. I unfortunately cannot stay, I cannot take you. This is actually something that we see Ukrainians do, is take cats with them. And we saw a lot of displaced people sort of carrying cats in the portable carriers, but the Chersonsky could not take their cats with them. But yes, she is somebody who, in her poetry, sort of focuses on that emotional resilience. Yelena Aktyorska is Boris Chersonsky's niece, and actually, so there is a character in the novel who is a parodic version of her uncle. The poet. Yeah, Pasha the poet, yes. Who is nothing like, I mean, Khersodsky is a very serious poet. Pasha is a failure, is a bumbling fool. But it's a loving book. It's a loving book that is, yes, this part of that Odessan humor that has helped the city in its resilience. And I guess this is, internal and external. External stereotype is Odessans are jokesters, people who tell jokes about themselves and all of those kind of things. And you do not want to be perceived as somebody who's funny, haha, all the time. But humor can help in even the darkest times. I mean, we know that even in the conditions of the horrors of World War II, I mean, even in the conditions of the Holocaust, there were Jewish writers who were deliberately trying to think of things, of elements of humor. We have, in the darkest moments of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, also dark humor being something that helps Ukrainians survive and pull through. And so this is, humor is this an ambiguous thing. It's like this, Derrida's sort of pharmacon by Plato. So it's both can be a cure or it can be a poison. We do not want it to become a poison. We want it to be something that can help us, that can give us strength, that can help us sustain ourselves going forward. And Aktyorskaya's novel is a good example of that. I'm not sure what happened. I do not know her personally, why she did not continue follow up after that book, which is a very impressive debut. So hopefully there will be more.
Thank you so much. That definitely inspired me to read some poetry. I hope you too. I would like to thank Professor Chernetsky so much for your wonderful lecture, for saving us all tonight from the madness of today's news. And let's give a round of applause.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
And thank you, the audience, for coming tonight. Have a good evening.